Chapter 1: The House of Calm. The sun was a hammer. It beat down on the parched earth, on the canvas tops of the equipment tents, on the necks of the digging crew. Dust, fine as powdered bone, rose with every footstep, coating everything in a uniform layer of ochre. Dr. Iona Vajuva stood under the scant shade of a solitary olive tree, its leaves silvered with the same gritty film. She watched her team work, a small, dedicated company waging a quiet war against time and soil. Her eyes, shielded by sunglasses, missed nothing. The precise flick of a trowel in a student's hand, the weary slump in the shoulders of a veteran excavator, the shimmer of heat rising from the exposed stones of Trench C. They were on the outskirts of the primary Pompeii park, on a parcel of land privately owned until a recent government acquisition. For months, their work had yielded the expected: pottery shards, a few corroded bronze implements, the fragmented foundations of what was likely a modest vineyard farmhouse. Important work, but not the sort which rewrites history. Not until Cormac Riley's machine started screaming. Cormac, a man whose confidence often outpaced his years, operated the ground-penetrating radar. He treated the sophisticated device like a temperamental extension of his own nervous system. For a week, it had produced mundane, predictable scans of stratified volcanic soil and rock. 3 days ago, it had returned an anomaly so clean, so geometrically perfect, it looked like an error. A massive, void-like rectangle buried 12 meters down. "It's a structure," Cormac had insisted, jabbing a finger at the monitor. His screen showed a three-dimensional rendering in stark blues and greens. Completely intact, sealed. The density readings are off the charts. It's like nothing collapsed, nothing got in. Now, the deep thrum of a heavy-duty excavator vibrated through the soles of Iona's boots. It clawed away the last layers of compacted earth and lapilli, revealing the top of a stone roof, impossibly whole. There were no signs of the crushing weight which had flattened so much of the ancient city. It was as if the pyroclastic flow had, for some reason, granted this one place a strange mercy. Julian Croft, the team's linguist and resident romantic, practically vibrated with excitement beside her. His face, usually pale and bookish, was flushed with the sun and a manic energy. "Iona, have you ever seen anything like it? The preservation. It's a time capsule, a perfect, hermetically sealed bottle thrown to us from antiquity. Let's open the bottle before we celebrate what's inside, Julian," Iona said. Her voice was calm, measured, a counterpoint to his effervescence. She respected his passion. It was a fire which could illuminate the darkest corners of the past. But fire, she knew, also consumed. "Ben, what is our status?" Ben Carter approached from the excavation pit. A former soldier, he moved with an economy of motion, his presence a solid, reassuring block against the chaotic backdrop of the dig. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. "We've cleared the roofline, found what looks like a peristyle, a central courtyard. It's choked with ash, but the surrounding structure is solid. We located a primary entrance. Bronze door, heavy, still in its frame." "No signs of collapse?" Iona asked, her gaze fixed on the pit. "None," Ben confirmed. "The door's locked or barred from the inside. We'll need to cut it. It's the only way in without compromising the walls." His expression was neutral, but Iona could detect a flicker of something in his eyes, a soldier's caution. This was too clean, too easy, and too strange. "Do it," she commanded. "Slowly. I want air quality samples the moment you breach the seal. Full respirators for the entry team." The process was agonizingly slow. A portable generator sputtered to life, powering a diamond-bladed cutting tool. Its high-pitched whine sliced through the afternoon torpor. The crew, sensing the gravity of the moment, gathered at a respectful distance. They watched as Ben and a colleague, clad in white hazmat suits with cumbersome respirator masks, worked on the ancient bronze. Sparks showered onto the gray ash, dying instantly. Metal groaned in protest after 2 millennia of silence. Julian paced, unable to contain himself. Imagine Iona, texts, papyrus scrolls which didn't burn, frescoes untouched by time, clothing, food, the minutiae of daily life all waiting for us. This could be our villa of the papyri. This could be more. It could be an empty house which was unusually fortunate, Julian, Iona countered, though her own heart beat a hard, rapid rhythm against her ribs. She was a scientist, a woman of process and evidence. But the archaeologist within her, the part which chose this life, was a treasure hunter. The thrill of the unknown was a current running deep beneath her composed surface. A final, wrenching shriek of metal echoed from the pit, followed by a loud clang. One of the cutters gave a thumbs up. Ben's voice, muffled and tinny through his radio, crackled. "We have a breach. Air is, still, stagnant. No detectable toxins on the initial reading. It smells like dust, old stone." Iona nodded, pulling on her own respirator. "I'm coming down. Cormac, I want a full sensor sweep with the remote drone. Julian, you're with me. Ben, you have the point." Descending the temporary metal ladder into the excavation felt like a journey into a grave. The air grew cooler, the sunlight vanished, replaced by the stark, artificial beams of their headlamps. They stood before the door. A section of the bronze had been cut away, creating a jagged opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. The darkness within was absolute, a solid wall of black which seemed to push against the light. Ben went first, his powerful flashlight beam cutting a path. Iona followed, her hand resting on the cold, ancient metal as she contorted her body to pass through the opening. She emerged into a small, dark space. A vestibule, her light played over the floor. The mosaics were pristine. A detailed rendering of a hunting dog, its muscles coiled, its eyes made of polished obsidian, stared up at her. There was no layer of ash here, no debris. The air was thick, still, and cold, carrying a scent not of decay, but of profound age, of stone and dry plaster and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. "Clear," Ben's voice echoed unnaturally in the confined space. Julian squeezed through behind Iona, his breath fogging the inside of his faceplate. "Incredible," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Utterly incredible." They moved forward, a tight formation of three, their beams dancing across the walls. They were in an atrium. In the center, a shallow pool, an impluvium, was dry but clean. The walls were covered in frescoes, the colors so vivid they might have been painted yesterday. Mythological scenes, pastoral landscapes, intricate geometric patterns. The artistry was exquisite. "This is the home of someone exceedingly wealthy," Julian murmured, drifting toward a wall depicting a scene from the Odyssey. "A senator, perhaps. A merchant of the highest order." "Where is the furniture?" Ben's practical question cut through Julian's awe. "A house like this. There should be tables, couches, chests. There's nothing. It's empty." He was right. The rooms they passed through were architecturally perfect but barren. It was as if the owners had packed their belongings and left moments before the eruption. Yet the door had been barred from within. A contradiction. A puzzle. Iona filed it away, her mind cataloging every detail, every inconsistency. Cormac's voice crackled over the radio. "Iona, the drone is picking up something in the largest chamber straight ahead of your position. A big open space, a tablinum, I think. There are shapes, organic returns, multiple, but they're not moving." "Understood," Iona replied, her grip tightening on her own flashlight. "We're proceeding." They moved down a short, wide corridor, their boots silent on the mosaic floors. The beam of Iona's light found the entrance to the main reception room. It was vast. The ceiling soared high above them, and the far wall was dominated by what appeared to be a colossal mural. But her attention was not on the art. It was on the figures arranged in the center of the room. There were 4 of them. They were not skeletons. They were not piles of ash. They were plaster casts, the famous, haunting figures of Pompeii, formed where the volcanic material had filled the voids left by decayed bodies. But these were unlike any she had ever seen. The casts from Pompeii and Herculaneum were always the same, figures contorted in agony, shielding their faces, curled into fetal positions, frozen in the last desperate moments of life. These were different. A man, clearly the patriarch, sat in a high-backed stone chair, his posture erect, his hands resting calmly on his knees. A woman stood beside him, her head slightly inclined, one hand on his shoulder. A young man and a young woman stood a few feet away, side by side. Their poses were not of terror. They were not of agony. They were poses of serene, placid stillness. They were an audience. All 4 of them, perfectly preserved, were facing the far wall. They were staring at the mural. Julian let out a choked gasp, his hand flying to his mask. "What is this there? Calm." Ben swept his light over the figures, his stance shifting into something more defensive. "This isn't right. This is all wrong." Iona stepped forward, her light joining the others on the silent family. The detail was extraordinary. The folds of their togas, the straps of their sandals, the delicate features of their faces. The young woman's face was tilted upwards, a single, perfectly formed plaster tear track visible on her cheek. The father's face was unreadable, a mask of stoicism. They were not waiting for death. They were watching something. She slowly turned her light, moving it away from the family and onto the object of their 2,000-year-old attention. The great mural on the far wall. The entire team fell silent. The only sound was the harsh, amplified rasp of their own breathing through the respirators. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Iona felt a coldness creep up her spine which had nothing to do with the subterranean chill. The figures were not just calm. They looked transfixed, enthralled. as if the eruption of Vesuvius itself was a minor interruption to a far more important spectacle, as if they had chosen to stay to sit and to watch the show. Chapter 2: The Unblinking Eye. For a long moment, the universe consisted only of the hiss of regulated air and the dance of light beams on ancient plaster. The silence in the tablinum was a physical presence. It was heavier than the tons of rock and ash above them. It was the collected silence of 60 generations, and it pressed in on them, deadening sound, chilling the skin. Julian was the first to move. He drifted forward, a moth drawn to a strange, dark flame. His headlamp created a halo around the plaster family, illuminating the fine, gray dust which clung to them. "They chose this," he breathed, his voice a reverent whisper over the comms. "They did not try to flee. They sat down and faced their end. Why, what could possibly make someone do that?" Iona's attention remained on the wall. The mural, no, it was more than a mural. A normal fresco was a painting on plaster, a flat surface. This had depth. It was a bas-relief with figures and landscapes carved to stand out from the background. But even that description felt inadequate. The light from her lamp seemed to sink into it, to be swallowed by the pigments. The colors were rich, dominated by deep blues, earthy ochres, and a startling, visceral crimson, yet they did not reflect the light with the flat, chalky quality of ancient paint. They seemed to possess their own internal luminosity. She took a step closer, her scientific curiosity warring with a primal sense of wrongness. The scene depicted a room. It was an uncanny, unsettling mirror of the very chamber in which they stood. There was the high ceiling, the pattern on the floor mosaics, even the stone chair in which the plaster patriarch sat. And in the fresco, in the carved room, sat a family. A man, a woman, a son, a daughter. They were rendered with breathtaking, photorealistic detail. Their faces, their postures, their clothing, they were an exact match for the plaster casts. Except they were not made of plaster. In the carving, they were rendered in warm, living tones. They were alive, and they were staring out of the fresco, looking directly at the spot where the real family sat. "It's a portrait," Julian said, his voice catching. "A family portrait. They're watching a portrait of themselves." "No," Iona said, her own voice tight. She walked along the wall, running her gloved hand over the cool, impossibly smooth surface near the fresco's edge. "The perspectives are wrong. The figures in the relief are looking at the family. The family is looking at the relief. They are watching each other." Ben, ever the pragmatist, was not looking at the art. He was scanning the room, his beam probing the corners, the ceiling, the empty doorways. "The exit is behind them," he stated flatly. "The way we came in. If they wanted to run, they would have turned around. Whatever they were looking at, they thought it was more important than survival." He paused, his light coming to rest on the face of the plaster father. "Or they couldn't look away." "Cormac, are you seeing this?" Iona spoke into her radio. "I want a full-spectrum analysis of this wall. Laser scan, thermal, ultraviolet, everything you have. There's something wrong with this material." Cormac's voice returned, strained with excitement. "Iona, the readings are insane. The drone's sensors are going haywire. I'm not getting a coherent reflection. It's like the wall is absorbing the laser. And thermal. It's cold. Colder than the surrounding stone. Several degrees colder. That makes no sense. It should be the same ambient temperature. Iona approached the fresco until she was only a few feet away. She could see the fine details now. The artist had been a master. She could see the tension in the carved father's hands, the subtle, desperate pleading in the son's eyes, the glistening tears on the daughter's cheeks, rendered in some opalescent, crystalline mineral. This was not a scene of peace. It was a scene of silent, restrained torment. And the father, his name came to her mind unbidden, Cassius. He looked like a Cassius, stern patrician in absolute control of his terror. His eyes, carved from some dark, polished stone, seemed to follow her. It was a common trick of masterful sculpture, an optical illusion. She knew this, but the knowledge did little to quell the unease prickling at the base of her skull. Julian had moved to stand directly in front of the plaster daughter. He was captivated by her. The single, perfect tear, the tragic, beautiful stillness. Vipsania, he whispered. He was numbing them, giving them life beyond the plaster. She was so frightened, yet she stayed. They all stayed, Ben cut in, his tone sharp. Don't start making up stories for them, Julian. These are archaeological artifacts. Let's treat them as such. They were people, Ben. Julian shot back, turning to face him. The two men stood in the stark beams of their headlamps, their faceless, masked visages confronting each other. People who made a choice we can't comprehend. My job is to try and understand that choice, to give them a voice. My job is to make sure we all get out of this hole in one piece, Ben retorted. And this place is setting off every alarm I have. Enough, Iona's command cut the tension. We will do this by the book. Lena is waiting with the cataloging equipment. We'll set up lighting and monitoring. We will photograph everything. We will take samples. We will be methodical. She was talking as much to herself as to them, reinforcing the familiar rituals of her profession against the rising tide of the inexplicable. The next few hours were a blur of controlled activity. Portable LED light stands were brought in, flooding the room with a flat, sterile glare which banished the shadows, but did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. Lena Sari, the young graduate student, entered the chamber, her initial awe quickly replaced by a quiet, unnerved focus as she began the meticulous process of documenting the site. Cormac, frustrated with the drone's failures, brought his equipment into the villa itself. He set up a portable workstation, wires snaking across the 2,000-year-old mosaics. He aimed a sophisticated 3D laser scanner at the bas-relief. "Okay, starting the topographical scan," he announced. The device emitted a low hum, and a thin, red line of light began to crawl across the wall. It moved over the painted plaster, over the carved stone, and then it reached the fresco. The line vanished. "What the hell?" Cormac muttered, tapping at his keyboard. He rebooted the system and tried again. The red laser line traveled across the wall and once again was completely swallowed the moment it touched the edge of the central scene. It did not register on the surface. It just disappeared into it. "It's not reflecting," he said, baffled. "The software can't get a distance reading. It's like I'm pointing it at an open door." He stood up and walked to the wall, peering at it. "It's solid. I can touch it. But the laser passes right through, or into it." Iona left Lena to her work and joined Cormac. She studied the fresco again, her eyes tracing the lines of the figures within. She focused on the daughter, Vipsania, as Julian had named her. The girl's expression was one of profound sadness. Her carved eyes seemed to glisten. Iona leaned closer. The glistening. It wasn't just the mineral. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of movement, she saw the light shift on the carved tear as if it had trembled. She pulled away, her breath catching, a trick of the light, the shifting beams from their lamps. It had to be. "I want a sample," she said, her voice strained. "A micro sample from the edge of the carving. We need to know what this material is." Getting the sample was a delicate operation. Using a specialized high-speed drill with a microscopic diamond bit, Iona carefully approached the fresco. She chose a spot on the edge of the carved frame, away from the figures. The moment the bit touched the surface, the drill screamed, the pitch rising to a painful shriek before it cut out, the motor smoking. "It's harder than diamond," Cormac said, his eyes wide. "Nothing is harder than diamond." The day wore on. The team worked under a growing cloud of tension and frustration. Every scientific tool they used on the fresco failed. It defied analysis. It absorbed light, it emitted cold, and it was made of a material which could not be drilled, scanned, or identified. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the excavation site, Julian remained in the tablinum. He had spent hours sitting on a crate, simply observing the plaster figures and the fresco, his notebook lying forgotten by his side. He was particularly focused on Vipsania. Iona had watched him with growing concern. He wasn't studying an artifact anymore. He was holding a vigil. Iona decided they had done enough for one day. The mystery of the villa was not going to be solved in a few hours. "All right, let's pack it up," she announced. "We'll post a guard and resume in the morning." Ben readily agreed, already directing the crew to secure the equipment. Lena, looking pale and exhausted, was relieved. Only Julian seemed reluctant. "I think I should stay," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the fresco. "There's something here, a language, not of words. I can almost understand it." "You're overtired, Julian," Iona said firmly. "We all are. You'll see it with fresh eyes tomorrow." He finally relented, standing up and stretching. As he turned to leave, he cast one last look at the fresco. "Good night, Vipsania," he whispered, so softly Iona almost missed it. As she was climbing the ladder out of the villa, Iona took one final look back into the silent, artificially lit room. She looked at the family of plaster, forever seated. She looked at the family in the fresco, forever trapped. And she looked at the unblinking, obsidian eyes of the father, Cassius. The light from her headlamp struck them, and for an instant she was certain. It was not a trick of light or shadow. She saw them turn, just a fraction of a degree, following her as she left. Chapter 3: A Voice in the Dust. The days that followed fell into a strange, unsettling rhythm. The world outside the villa continued its normal course. The Italian sun beat down, the generator hummed, the rest of the dig site operated with routine efficiency. But inside the unearthed structure, time seemed to warp. The air remained unnaturally cold and still, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the subdued sounds of the team's work. The villa felt disconnected from the world, a pocket of ancient coldness resisting the summer heat. Iona's scientific mind struggled against the mounting evidence of the impossible. The material of the fresco remained unidentifiable. Every sample attempt failed. Every scanning technology returned gibberish or nothing at all. The phenomenon became the team's obsession. They called it the absence. Cormac theorized it was some kind of geological freak, a type of volcanic glass which bent light in ways they didn't understand. Iona suspected something else, a thought she barely allowed to form, something which whispered of technologies far beyond Roman capabilities. The psychological toll was more immediate. Team members became irritable and withdrawn. Sleep offered little rest, with many complaining of vivid, disquieting dreams set within long, silent corridors. The local Italian crew grew wary, making signs to ward off the evil eye when they thought no one was watching. They spoke in hushed tones of La Casa Silenziosa, the silent house, and the family cursed to watch the walls forever. Ben Carter maintained a perimeter, his vigilance bordering on paranoia. He doubled the night watch and forbade anyone from entering the villa alone. His interactions with Julian grew increasingly sharp. "He's not stable, Iona," Ben told her one evening as they stood watching the sunset paint Vesuvius in shades of orange and purple. "He spends all day in that room. He talks to them. I heard him today, whispering to the girl." "He is a linguist, Ben. He's trying to interpret the scene," Iona countered, though her defense felt weak even to her own ears. "He's not interpreting, he's communing," Ben said, his jaw tight. "That thing in there, it's a hook, and it's got him." Iona couldn't deny Julian's fixation. He had filled an entire notebook with frantic, looping script, not with translations but with emotional impressions. He wrote of overwhelming sorrow, of crushing loneliness, of a desperate yearning for release. He claimed the fresco was a psychic sounding board, projecting the final emotions of the family. His focus was almost entirely on Vipsania. He described her not as a carving, but as a prisoner. He would sit for hours in front of her plaster cast, then turn to the fresco, his expression one of deep, troubled empathy. "Don't you see the tragedy?" he asked Iona during a heated discussion. "She's trapped in there, they all are. They're not just images, they're echoes, souls caught in amber. Vipsania is crying out for help. We're the first people to hear her in 2,000 years." "You are not hearing anything, Julian," Iona said, her patience wearing thin. "You are projecting a narrative onto an artifact. It is a dangerous path for an academic, for anyone." "Is it?" he shot back, his eyes feverish. "Or are you refusing to see what's right in front of you because it doesn't fit into any of your textbooks?" The first concrete anomaly occurred a week after the discovery. Lena was recataloguing the few small items found in the outer rooms when she noticed a discrepancy. A small bronze stylus, logged as item 27 from the kitchen area, was missing from its evidence bag. A thorough search of the lab tent yielded nothing. Lena was distraught, blaming herself for the oversight. 2 days later, Ben found it. It was lying on the floor of the tablinum, placed neatly at the base of Vipsania's plaster cast, almost like an offering. No one had an explanation. The night guard swore no one had entered the villa. The security camera footage, when reviewed, showed a period of static, a 2-minute gap during the deepest part of the night. Cormac, haggard and frustrated, blamed a power fluctuation from the generator, but his explanation lacked conviction. The incident deepened the rift in the team. Ben saw it as a deliberate act of provocation by a disturbed Julian. Julian claimed it was a sign, an attempt at communication from the other side. Iona found herself adrift in the sea of uncertainty between them. She decided to confront the mystery head-on. Late one afternoon, when the others had retired to the main camp for a meal, she went back into the villa alone, breaking Ben's protocol. She needed to see it without Julian's romanticism, without Ben's suspicion, without Cormac's technological frustrations. She needed to face the absence on her own terms. The tablinum was lit by a single battery-powered work lamp, casting long, distorted shadows. The Plaster family sat in their eternal audience, silent and imposing. Iona stood before the fresco, forcing herself to be an objective observer. It was a work of art, nothing more. A masterpiece of a lost technique, but a human creation nonetheless. She focused on Cassius, his carved face impassive and stern. A Roman patriarch, a stoic, he would not show fear, he would face the end with dignity. She moved her gaze to his wife, Flavia, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Then to the son, Lucius, his jaw clenched in a show of defiant terror. Finally, her eyes rested on Vipsania, the tear-glistened cheek, the upturned, pleading face. It was Vipsania who was the key. She was the emotional heart of the piece, the figure designed to elicit sympathy, a deliberate artistic choice. Iona moved closer, her analytical mind reasserting control. She studied the craftsmanship, the way the unknown material was worked. It was seamless. There were no tool marks, no joints. It was as if the entire scene had been grown, not carved. As she leaned in, examining the fine details of Vipsania's toga, she heard a sound. A faint scratching noise. She froze, every muscle tensing. It was coming from the wall, from the fresco itself. It was a dry, scraping sound like stone dragging on stone. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. The sound stopped. Rats, she told herself. A trick of the acoustics in the chamber. She was letting the atmosphere get to her. She straightened up, taking a deep, calming breath which fogged the air. She decided to try something. She had the team's high-sensitivity audio recorder with her, a device capable of picking up the faintest of sounds. She placed it on the floor, aimed the parabolic microphone directly at the fresco, and pressed record. She would leave it overnight, collect empirical data, turn this house of ghosts into a house of facts. Satisfied with her plan, she turned to leave. As her headlamp beam swept across the room, it passed over the face of the plaster cast of Julian's Vipsania, and Iona's blood ran cold. The tear track, it was darker, wetter, as if the plaster had absorbed moisture. It was a subtle change, one easily missed. But she had studied these figures for days. She knew their surfaces intimately. A dark line of moisture now traced the path of the ancient, sculpted tear. She backed out of the room slowly, her scientific composure shattered. She did not run. She walked, deliberately, her footsteps echoing loudly in the sudden, terrifying emptiness of the villa. The next morning the camp was buzzing. Julian was missing. His bed in the small tent he occupied had not been slept in. A frantic search began. Ben organized the crew, his face a grim mask. Iona's mind immediately went to the villa. She ran to the excavation pit, ignoring the calls of her colleagues. She scrambled down the ladder and burst into the house, her flashlight beam cutting wildly through the gloom. She reached the tablinum, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And there he was. Julian was standing in the center of the room, his back to her. He stood perfectly still, facing the fresco. His posture was unnaturally rigid. "Julian," Iona called out, her voice trembling slightly. He did not respond. He did not move. "Julian, answer me," she said, louder this time, stepping into the room. As she got closer, she saw it. His hands were pressed flat against the surface of the fresco, against the image of the wailing son, Lucius. He was pushing, as if trying to force his way through solid stone. "Julian," she grabbed his shoulder. He recoiled at her touch, spinning around. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, a stark red line against his white skin. His fingertips were raw and bleeding, scraped from pressing against the unyielding wall. "I heard her," he whispered, his voice hoarse, cracking. "I heard her crying all night. She called to me. She needs our help, Iona." "What are you talking about?" Iona demanded, her fear mixing with anger. "You're hurting yourself." "No, you don't understand," he insisted, his gaze shifting back to the fresco, to the weeping image of Vipsania. "She spoke to me, not in words, a voice made of sadness. She showed me. Their prison, the endless gray, the silence. They can see us. They have been watching the world through this window for centuries, waiting." He reached out a bloody hand, his fingers tracing the air where Vipsania's face was carved. "She wants out," he said, his eyes filling with a crazed, desperate light. "She told me how it's a trade, a kindness, a soul for a soul. We just have to let them out." He suddenly lunged toward the wall again. Iona reacted instinctively, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "Stop it, Julian." He struggled against her, his strength surprising. He was completely lost in his delusion. As they wrestled, his flailing hand struck the audio recorder she had left on the floor, knocking it over. Suddenly, a sound filled the room, a soft, whispering voice. It was coming from the recorder's small speaker, playing back what it had captured during the night. It was not Latin. It was not Greek. It was a strange, sibilant language, a series of soft, pleading whispers which seemed to coil in the air. And underneath the whispers, another sound. A single, pure, musical note, sustained and impossibly sad. The sound of a woman weeping. Julian stopped struggling. He turned his head toward the sound, a look of rapturous recognition on his face. "You hear it," he whispered, a tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "It's her. It's Vipsania's song." He then looked at Iona, his eyes suddenly clear and calm. "She said you would be the one to open the door." Before Iona could react, he took a deep breath and his body went limp, collapsing to the floor in a dead faint. Chapter 4: An Invitation. Julian's collapse shattered the fragile equilibrium of the expedition. Ben and two crew members carried his unconscious form out of the villa and into the blinding light of day. An ambulance was called, its distant siren a modern sound intruding upon the ancient silence. As they took him away, Iona saw his face. He was pale as marble, his expression unnervingly peaceful, a faint smile on his lips. It was the smile of a man who had found his purpose. The audio recording became the new focal point of the mystery. Iona played it again in the relative sanity of her work tent, the flaps tied shut against the outside world. The strange, whispering language was clear. Beneath it, the sound of weeping was unmistakable. It was not a song. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of grief. Cormac ran a full diagnostic on the audio file, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "There's no tampering," he concluded, shaking his head in disbelief. "The file is clean. The ambient noise profile matches the room. Whatever that is, the recorder picked it up inside the tablinum last night." He isolated the whispering, running it through translation software. The programs came back with nothing. It did not match any known language, ancient or modern. "It's a hoax," Ben insisted, his arms crossed, his face set like stone. He had refused to listen to the recording. "Julian faked it. He's obsessed. He needs psychological help." "His fingerprints are scraped off, Ben," Iona countered, her voice low. "He was pressing against that wall with enough force to injure himself. That is not a hoax. That is compulsion." "Then the house is getting to him," Ben said. "The air, a fungus, something. We should seal it. For good. Report the find and let the ministry handle it with a specialized team." "And what do we tell them?" Iona challenged. "That we are abandoning a site of unprecedented historical significance because our linguist had a nervous breakdown and we recorded a ghost. They would laugh us out of the country. I would laugh us out of the country." But she knew Ben was right to be concerned. The villa was no longer just an archaeological puzzle. It was a threat. The events were escalating. A missing object reappears as an offering. A plaster cast weeps. A team member is driven to a state of violent obsession. And now, a voice from nowhere. She had to understand the source. That evening, after the majority of the crew had left, Iona, Ben, and Cormac returned to the villa. The ambulance had long since departed, leaving behind a profound sense of violation. The place felt different now, charged with a new and predatory energy. "I'm going to try something," Cormac announced, unpacking a new piece of equipment. It was a high-frequency acoustic emitter. "If the fresco is absorbing light and energy, maybe it's a two-way street. Maybe I can get a response." "What kind of response?" Ben asked, his hand resting near the heavy maglite on his belt. "A vibration, a resonance. Anything to prove it's not just a weird rock," Cormac said, setting up the device. He aimed it at the fresco. "This will emit a series of tones, cycling up through the frequencies. Most of it will be outside our hearing range. If there's any unique resonant frequency in that material, the system will detect it." He switched it on. The device emitted a low hum, but no audible tones. A graph on his laptop screen began to trace a steady, flat line. For minutes, nothing happened. The line remained flat as the frequency climbed higher and higher into the ultrasonic range. See, nothing, Ben said, his skepticism evident. Wait, Cormac said, leaning toward his screen. There, I'm getting something. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor appeared on the graph. It was a feedback loop. The fresco was resonating, but not with the frequency Cormac was broadcasting. It was emitting its own frequency, a faint but distinct signal. It's singing back, Cormac whispered, astonished. He adjusted the emitter, trying to match the frequency the wall was producing. As he dialed it in, the tremor on the graph grew stronger. The hum from the emitter deepened, dropping into the audible range. A low, vibrating thrum filled the chamber, a sound so deep it seemed to resonate in their bones. And the fresco changed. The light in the room seemed to dim, drawn towards the wall. The colors of the fresco intensified, the blues deepening to twilight, the reds glowing like cooling embers. The scene, the mirrored room with the trapped family, gained an impossible, horrifying clarity. It was no longer a carving. It looked like a window into a gray, silent world. The figures within moved. It was not a flicker this time. It was a deliberate, fluid motion. Cassius, the father, slowly raised his head. His dark, polished eyes stared directly at them. He was not looking at the plaster casts. He was looking at Iona, Ben, and Cormac. His expression was one of immense weariness, of ancient, soul-crushing patience. Flavia, the mother, turned her head, her face a mask of pleading anguish. Lucius, the son, began to beat his fists against the inside of the window, but his movements were slow, languid, as if moving through water. There was no sound, only the silent, desperate pantomime of his rage. And Vipsania. She took a single, graceful step forward, her hand rising to press against the surface from her side. Her weeping face was a portrait of perfect, theatrical sorrow. Her eyes found Iona's. Iona felt a wave of vertigo. Her mind screamed that this was impossible, a hallucination, a trick of the resonating frequencies on her optic nerves. But the image was too stable, too real. This was not a projection. This was a connection. Julian was right. They were in there. They were alive. Ben let out a string of curses, taking a step back and pulling his flashlight from his belt as if it were a weapon. Cormac, shut it off. Shut it off now. Cormac, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and scientific awe, fumbled with his laptop. The thrumming sound continued. From behind them, a new sound, a dry, cracking noise. Iona and Ben spun around. Their flashlight beams landed on the plaster family. The plaster cast of Cassius, the father, had a thin, dark crack running down its serene face. Another crack appeared on its shoulder. The figure sat, immobile, but it was breaking apart from within. The same was happening to the others. The mother, the son. Their gray plaster shells were fracturing, splintering like drying mud. What's happening to them? Iona yelled over the thrumming noise. A thought cold and sharp as glass pierced through her panic. A trade, a soul for a soul. The plaster casts were the original vessels, empty husks. The prison required a swap. To let one out, one had to go in. Julian had not been driven mad. He had been given an invitation, and he had accepted. Vipsania in the fresco window pressed her hand flat against the barrier. Her pleading eyes never left Iona's. It was a clear, unmistakable gesture. "Help me. Take my hand. Let me out." The cracking of the plaster grew louder, more insistent. The cast of the son, Lucius, began to crumble, pieces of its shoulder falling to the floor, revealing nothing but a hollow cavity within. They were disintegrating. Their anchors in this world were failing. "It's the machine," Ben shouted. "It's breaking them." He lunged for Cormac's equipment, ready to smash it. "No, wait," Cormac yelled, finally snapping out of his trance. He typed a furious sequence of commands. The deep thrumming cut out abruptly. The silence which crashed back into the room was deafening. The fresco instantly reverted. The impossible depth vanished. The figures became still, flat carvings once more. The colors dulled. It was just a wall again, a strange, dead wall. The cracking from the plaster cast stopped. The three of them stood in the sudden quiet, breathing heavily, their chests aching from the subsonic vibration. They stared at the damaged casts, at the new network of dark lines which marred their surfaces. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice low and shaky. "We need to seal this place and walk away." Iona, though terrified, felt a surge of something else, a fierce, defiant anger. This was not a ghost story. This was something else, a prison. And its inmates were intelligent. They were manipulative. They had targeted the most empathetic member of her team and consumed him. They had used Vipsania's sorrow as a weapon. She walked to the fresco, her boots crunching on fallen plaster dust. She stood before the image of Cassius, the patient, unblinking patriarch. She stared into his dead, stone eyes. "What are you?" she said, her voice a harsh whisper in the silent room. She received no answer, but as she watched, she saw something she had not noticed before. On the carved frame of the fresco, almost hidden in the decorative scrollwork, were tiny, almost microscopic inscriptions. They were not the grand, formal letters of a public dedication. They were frantic, desperate scratches, a warning. She leaned in, using the magnifier on her multi-tool. She could make out a few words of vulgar Latin, the frantic scrawl of a terrified hand. "ZNONAPERIRE, do not open. FALLAXESD, IT is a deception. SBCTNT, they are watching." And one more line, scratched deeper than the rest, a final, hopeless plea. DEUSNOSERIPYT, a god tore US away. Iona stepped back, a profound chill settling deep in her bones. A god. The eruption wasn't the disaster which trapped them. The eruption was what saved everyone else. Suddenly her radio crackled to life. It was Lena, her voice high with panic. "Iona, Ben, you need to get to the medical tent. It's Julian. He's awake. He's awake and he's asking for you, Iona." Chapter 5. The Price of Pity. The run from the villa to the medical tent was a frantic, stumbling flight through the deepening twilight. The world outside the excavation pit seemed unreal, the chirping of crickets and the warm evening air a flimsy facade over the cold, ancient horror they had just witnessed. Ben flanked Iona, his long strides easily keeping pace, his face grim. Cormac trailed behind, pale and shaken. Lena met them at the tent flap, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "He just woke up, a few minutes ago. The paramedics were about to transport him. He sat straight up and started demanding to see you, Iona. Iona pushed past her into the brightly lit tent. Two paramedics stood by a cot, looking baffled. Julian was sitting up, a thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The bleeding from his nose had stopped, and the raw scrapes on his fingers had been bandaged. But it was his eyes that made Iona stop dead. They were clear. The feverish, obsessive glow was gone. He looked lucid, sane, and utterly, profoundly terrified. "Iona," he breathed, his voice raspy. "Thank God, don't go back in there. You have to seal it. You have to bury it." "Julian, what happened?" Iona asked, approaching his cot cautiously. Ben stood by the entrance, a sentinel watching for any sign of a relapse. "I saw it," Julian said, his hands trembling as he clutched the blanket. "When I touched the wall, she pulled me in, not my body, my mind, my consciousness. I was in there with them." He squeezed his eyes shut, a shudder racking his frame. "It's not a room, it's a void, it's gray. There's no warmth, no sound, no time, just waiting, and they are there with you, the family." "What are they?" Yona asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Monsters," Julian choked out. "They wear the faces of a Roman family, but it's a mask, a costume they've perfected over centuries. Cassius. He is not a man, he is a will, a cold, patient intelligence. The others are extensions of him, lures. Flavia offers comfort. Lucius offers a target for anger, and Vipsania," his voice broke. "Vipsania offers pity. Pity is their sharpest hook." He looked directly at Iona, his eyes pleading. "She sings her sorrow, and you can't help but listen. You want to save her. I wanted to save her. When you take her hand, when you accept the trade, you take her place in the void, and she takes yours in the world." A horrifying understanding dawned on Iona. Julian had been on the brink of the swap. He had accepted the invitation. His mind was already being pulled into the prison. What stopped it? Why are you here? "You," Julian said, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "Your recorder, when it played back her weeping, it created a resonance, an echo. For a moment there were two of her, one in the prison and the echo of her in the room. The prison, it got confused. The connection flickered. It spat me back out. It was like being born and dying at the same time." Ben stepped forward. "So it's over, you're free." Julian shook his head, a look of pure dread on his face. "No, it's not over. A trade was offered. A door was opened. I pulled back from the threshold, but the door is still open. The prison wants its payment, it feels unbalanced." As he spoke, a scream tore through the night air. It came from the direction of the excavation pit. It was one of the night guards. Ben was moving before anyone else, sprinting out of the tent and towards the sound. Iona was right behind him, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. They reached the edge of the pit. One of the guards was scrambling away from the ladder, his face white with terror, pointing down into the darkness. "Down there," he stammered. "The other one, Sergio. He went down to check the generator. He didn't answer his radio. I went to look and I saw. He couldn't finish, his words dissolving into terrified sobs. Ben descended the ladder, his heavy-duty flashlight cutting a swath through the darkness. Iona, overcoming her fear, followed. They entered the villa. The silence was absolute. The work lamps they had left on were dead. The generator had cut out. Sergio. Ben's voice boomed in the confined space, getting no reply. They moved cautiously towards the tablinum. The beam of Ben's flashlight pierced the gloom of the main chamber. It swept past the empty stone chair, past the crumbling plaster figures, and landed on the fresco. And standing in front of it was a figure. It was the second night guard, Sergio. His back was to them. He was standing motionless, his head cocked as if listening to something. "Sergio, step away from the wall," Ben ordered, his voice tight. The figure did not move, did not respond. Iona raised her own flashlight, her beam joining Ben's. A strange detail caught her eye. Sergio was a short, stocky man. The figure before them was slender, and it was wearing a simple, floor-length dress, not a guard's uniform. Slowly the figure turned. It was not Sergio. It was a young woman. Her face was pale, her features delicate and patrician. She had large, dark, sorrowful eyes. A single, perfect tear track stained her cheek. Her expression was not one of sadness anymore. It was a blank, curious, hungry look. It was the face from the fresco. It was Vipsania. She stood there, a creature of ancient stone and sorrow made flesh, her bare feet silent on the 2,000-year-old mosaic. The space she had occupied in the fresco was now empty, a blank, dark patch on the wall. Ben instinctively raised his heavy flashlight like a club. "What are you?" Vipsania's eyes flickered from Ben to Iona. A small, subtle smile touched her lips. It was a smile of release, of triumph. Then her gaze shifted to a spot just behind them, near the entrance to the room. From the shadows, a sound, a dry, scraping sound, the sound of stone dragging on stone. Iona and Ben spun around, their lights seeking the source of the noise. Standing in the doorway was a new figure. It was the rough, gray shape of a man, a plaster cast. It was still forming, the gray material seeming to flow and harden around a core. It was the same height and build as the missing guard, Sergio. As they watched, the face smoothed over, capturing a final, silent scream of terror. The prison had not been cheated. It had found another door. It had taken its payment. When Iona looked back at the fresco, Vipsania was gone. The only sound in the absolute silence was the soft, wet sound of the new plaster cast settling, and a faint, musical sigh of a young woman taking her first breath of fresh air in 2,000 years. Chapter 6. The Footprints of Ash. The final, soft sigh of Vipsania's first breath echoed in the tablinum, a sound more profound and final than any shout. It was the sound of a lock clicking open. For a heartbeat, the world was frozen. Iona and Ben stood transfixed, their flashlight beams illuminating the two impossible points of a horrifying equation. The empty, dark patch on the fresco where the daughter once wept, and the freshly formed plaster cast of Sergio, his final moment of terror now a permanent monument. Ben was the one who broke the spell. His reaction was not one of fear, but of pure, focused rage. He let out a harsh, guttural sound and took a step towards the new statue, his maglite held like a cudgel. "Ben, no." Iona's voice was sharp, cutting through his fury. He stopped, his shoulders heaving. "It killed him, Iona. It turned him into a garden gnome." "And what are you going to do?" she countered, her own voice trembling as she fought to keep control. "Smash it. Will that bring him back? We don't know what that will do." She looked from the statue to the fresco. The figures of Cassius, Flavia, and Lucius remained. They were still, but their stillness felt different now. It was the stillness of anticipation. They were waiting their turn. "We're leaving," Ben said, his voice a low growl. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard as iron, and pulled her away from the center of the room. "Now, before this house decides it wants another decoration." He did not need to convince her. She stumbled after him, her gaze fixed on the Sergio cast until they passed through the doorway and it was lost to the darkness. They half ran through the silent, empty rooms of the villa, their footsteps loud and clumsy on the mosaics. The air seemed to cling to them, thick and cold and charged with a triumphant energy. As they reached the vestibule, Iona's light caught something on the floor. Footprints. Small, bare footprints, perfectly outlined in a fine gray powder. They led from the tablinum towards the makeshift opening they had cut in the bronze door. "Ash," she breathed. "She's shedding it like grave dust." Ben didn't stop. He pushed her towards the opening. "Go, get out." She squeezed through the jagged hole, her suit snagging on the metal, and scrambled onto the dirt floor of the pit. The night air was a shock, warm and humid and smelling of earth and diesel from the generator. It was the air of the living world. Ben emerged right behind her, his face a pale, sweat-streaked mask in the moonlight. The remaining night guard, the one who had screamed, was huddled at the top of the pit, babbling to a small group of crew members who had been drawn by the commotion. He was incoherent, talking about a woman made of smoke and Sergio turning to stone. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and confusion. Ben climbed the ladder, his movements swift and sure. He took the terrified guard by the shoulders. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice leaving no room for hysterics. The guard flinched. "Una Donna, a woman. She came out of the hole. She just walked out. She wasn't wearing a suit. She looked right through me. Her eyes, Dio mio, her eyes were so sad." "Where did she go?" Ben pressed. The guard pointed a trembling finger towards the access road which led away from the dig site. "That way. She didn't make a sound. She just drifted." Iona reached the surface, pulling off her respirator and taking a deep gulp of real air. Her mind was racing, trying to assemble the fractured pieces of the last hour into a coherent structure. Vipsania was free. A creature from a 2,000-year-old prison was loose, and she had a head start. "Cormac," Iona yelled toward the camp, "get your drone now." Lights were coming on all over the camp. People were emerging from their tents, their faces etched with sleep and concern. Cormac came running, his laptop clutched to his chest. "What happened? Where's Sergio?" he asked, his eyes wide. "There's been an incident," Iona said, her voice strained. She looked at Ben. How could they explain this? How could they make anyone understand? Ben met her gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not here, not with them." "The second guard is missing," Ben said to the gathered crew, his voice taking on an authoritative tone which commanded their attention. "His partner had a panic attack. We are locking down the site. Nobody else goes near that pit." "Understood." The crew nodded, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. While Ben secured the area, Iona pulled Cormac aside. "I need you to fly the drone into the villa, into the main chamber. I need to see that wall." "Iona, what's going on?" Cormac pleaded, his face pale. "Just do it, Cormac. Please," she said, her voice cracking with the effort of holding herself together. He nodded, his technical curiosity overriding his fear. He quickly assembled the small quadcopter, his fingers deft. With a quiet whir, the drone lifted into the air. He guided it down into the dark square of the excavation pit and through the opening in the door. They watched on his laptop screen, the drone's high-definition camera feeding them a steady, night vision image. The camera feed showed the pristine outer rooms, then turned down the corridor into the tablinum. The image stabilized, focusing on the great fresco. Iona's breath caught in her throat. The scene was as it was before, with one glaring omission. The space where Vipsania had been was a flat, dark, featureless patch of the unidentifiable material. It was a void in the shape of a girl. And the other figures, they had changed. Cassius was no longer looking forward. His carved head was turned slightly, his stone eyes now aimed directly at the empty space his daughter had vacated. His impassive expression now held a clear, unmistakable trace of triumph. Flavia and Lucius were similarly turned, their gazes fixed on the hole on the exit. They looked like prisoners standing before an open cell door, waiting for their own names to be called. "They're watching it," Cormac whispered, horrified. "They're watching the hole she left behind." "They're waiting," Iona corrected him, her voice grim. "Ben, we need to find her." Ben had finished his instructions and returned to her side. He had been examining the ground near the pit with a powerful flashlight. "She left a trail," he said. He pointed his beam at the ground. Faintly visible in the dirt and gravel was a path of tiny, bare footprints, each one leaving behind a minute deposit of the same fine, gray ash they had seen inside. "It's like she's leaving a part of the prison behind with every step," Iona murmured, following the trail with her eyes. It led away from the pit, through the organized chaos of the dig site, and straight towards the dark, cypress-lined road that connected them to the modern world. They followed the trail, a slow, grim procession of two. The footprints were faint but consistent. Here, a perfect print on a flat piece of stone. There, a smudge of gray on a discarded piece of plastic. The trail was unerring. It did not deviate. It led straight to the asphalt of the service road. And there it stopped. "A vehicle," Ben said, sweeping his light across the road's surface. "She got a ride." Iona's mind spun with the implications. A woman who looked like she had stepped out of a history book, barefoot, covered in strange dust, had managed to flag down a car in the middle of the night. How? What had she said? What had she done to the driver? The image of Julian's manic, compelled state flashed in her mind. The thought of Vipsania using that same power on an unsuspecting civilian sent a chill down her spine. She looked back at the dig site, now a small island of artificial light in a vast sea of darkness. In the heart of that island was a house, a silent, waiting prison. They had been fools. They had treated it like a discovery, a puzzle to be solved. They had used their science and their tools trying to categorize and understand it. But it was not a passive artifact. It was a trap, a carefully baited 2,000-year-old trap, and they had not just sprung it. They had held the door open. "She's out, Ben," Iona said, the full weight of her words settling upon her. "We let her out." Ben looked down the long, dark road that led towards the distant glow of Naples. His expression was hard, stripped of all scientific curiosity, all shock. It was the face he must have worn in whatever war zone had forged him, the face of a man with an impossible mission. Then we go get her back. Chapter 7. The Hunger of a New World. The autostrada at night was a river of light, a torrent of red and white flowing through the dark Italian countryside. Vipsania sat in the passenger seat of the roaring refrigerated truck, a silent, still point in the rush of the modern world. The driver, a portly man named Enzo with a kind, weary face, had stopped for her on the side of the road. He had seen a girl, alone, barefoot, looking lost and frightened. His paternal instincts had taken over. He had expected tears, a frantic story of a broken-down car or a fight with a boyfriend. He had not expected this profound, unsettling silence. "Are you all right, Signorina?" he asked for the third time, his Italian thick with a Neapolitan accent. "You are not in trouble, the police." Vipsania turned her head slowly to look at him. She did not understand the sounds he made, the complex vibrations of his language, but she understood the emotions behind them. Concern, pity. These were familiar, useful things. They were the bait on the hook. For 2,000 years she had worn pity like a garment. Now, for the first time, she was the one holding the line. She offered him the expression she had perfected over centuries, a slight downturn of her lips, a widening of her dark, sorrowful eyes. She did not need to speak. Her grief was a universal language. Enzo's face softened. "Ah, poor girl, you don't want to talk, I understand." He turned his attention back to the road. "I will take you to the next service station. We will get you some shoes, something to eat. You look like you have seen a ghost." Vipsania turned her gaze back to the window. The world outside was a terrifying, exhilarating assault on her senses. The speed was nauseating. The lights of passing cars were like miniature angry suns, the sheer scale of it all. The metal beasts which moved without horses, the glowing towers in the distance, the cacophony of noise. It was a world she did not recognize, but it was a world brimming with life, with warmth, with the pulsing, vibrant energy of countless souls. The prison was a place of cold stillness, a gray, silent void where the only emotion was the recycled despair of its few inhabitants. This new world was a feast. She felt a new sensation, one she had only ever experienced as a faint echo from the minds of those who peered into the fresco. Hunger, not for food, a deeper, more fundamental craving. The truck was filled with Enzo's presence. His simple kindness, his worry for his children, his annoyance at his boss, his love for his wife. His emotions were a rich, complex meal. She could feel them washing over her, and her own empty core ached with need. He pulled the truck into a brightly lit service area, a chaotic oasis of petrol pumps, a cafe, and a small shop. "Here we are," he announced, killing the engine. "Let's get you something warm." He led her into the cafe. The blast of warm air, the smell of coffee and pastries, the loud chatter of other travelers. It was overwhelming. People stared at her, her simple, ancient dress, her bare, dusty feet, her strange stillness. She ignored them. She was focused on the symphony of new feelings around her. the impatience of a man in line, the joy of a child eating ice cream, the simmering anger between a couple at a corner table. It was all so delicious. Enzo sat her at a small table and went to the counter. He returned with a cup of hot chocolate and a pastry. He pushed the cup towards her. "Here, drink this. It will make you feel better." She looked at the steaming brown liquid. She did not know what it was. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the ceramic cup. It was warm. She drew on that warmth, a tiny, insignificant morsel of energy. Then she looked at Enzo. He was watching her, his face a picture of fatherly concern, such a powerful, giving emotion. She focused on it, on him. She gave him her sorrowful look again, letting her lower lip tremble. She reached across the table and placed her cool, slender hand on his rough, fleshy one. "Thank you," she said. The word was perfect. The accent was flawless. It was his accent. She had pulled the sound, the shape of the word directly from his mind. Enzo blinked, startled. "You can speak." "A little," she whispered, weaving the new words together from the fabric of his thoughts. "You are kind." His chest puffed with pride. "Of course, a man must help." She held his gaze, her dark eyes drawing him in. She did not need to speak further. She let her cultivated sadness flow from her, a current of silent, tragic energy. She had done this for millennia from behind a stone wall. To do it in person was intoxicatingly easy. Enzo's smile slowly faded. His face went slack. The concern in his eyes was replaced by a profound, listless apathy. He stared at his cup, his hand still under hers, but he was no longer seeing it. He was seeing nothing. She was drinking his pity, his kindness, his worry. She was draining the color from his soul, leaving a gray, empty husk. It was a more satisfying meal than any physical food. She pulled her hand away. Enzo did not move. He just sat there, a vacant shell, his hot chocolate growing cold. She stood up and walked out of the cafe, leaving him behind. No one tried to stop her. They averted their eyes from her strange, sad beauty. Outside she felt better, stronger. The gnawing emptiness inside her had been filled for a moment. She looked around the service station. So many lights, so many people, so many meals. A sleek black car pulled up to a petrol pump. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was yelling into a phone, his face contorted with anger and frustration. Such a powerful, wasteful emotion. She felt a new kind of hunger. The sun was rising when Iona and Ben finally reached the service station. They had spent hours fruitlessly searching, driving down dark roads, their only guide the insane, impossible story they both shared. It was Ben who had the idea to check the autostrada rest stops. "She needs to go where the people are," he had said, his voice raw with exhaustion. They saw the ambulance first, its lights flashing silently. Then they saw the police cars. They parked at a distance and approached on foot. They saw Enzo being led from the cafe by a paramedic. He was shuffling, his eyes empty, unresponsive to the questions of a concerned police officer. Iona's blood ran cold. "Ben, that's him. That's what it does." Ben's hand clenched into a fist. "It leaves them like that, empty." Julian said it fed on memory, on emotion, Iona murmured, watching the scene with a horrified fascination. "She's not killing them, she's consuming them. They spoke to a harried-looking officer, claiming to be colleagues of the missing guard, following a lead. The officer was dismissive until they described Vipsania. The girl in the white dress, barefoot, the officer asked, his interest piqued. We have 3 witnesses who saw her. They said she was with that man, he jerked a thumb towards Enzo. Then they saw her talking to another man by the pumps, a businessman. They got into his car, a black sedan, and drove off an hour ago, heading south towards Naples. The officer shook his head. Strange night. The first man is in some kind of catatonic shock. The second man's company just reported his car's GPS is offline, and he's not answering his phone. We thought it was a simple robbery, but nothing was taken. Iona and Ben exchanged a look. Robbery was not her goal. The businessman with the expensive car and the powerful anger. He was not a victim of crime. He was a vehicle and a buffet. They got back into their dusty field vehicle. The city of Naples, a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of millions, was less than an hour away. A needle in a haystack was an easy puzzle compared to this. They were hunting a 2,000-year-old emotional vampire in one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Iona's phone buzzed. It was Cormac. Iona, you need to see this, he said, his voice tight with panic. I've been monitoring the villa with the drone. I sent it back in. What is it, Cormac? The fresco, it's changing again. Lucius, the son. He's not pounding on the wall anymore. He's standing next to Cassius, and they are both looking out, directly at the camera, and Iona, Cassius is smiling. Chapter 8. The Whispering Gallery. Naples was a beast. It roared with the sound of scooters. It heaved with the press of bodies in narrow streets. It smelled of history and decay, and life lived at a fever pitch. For Iona and Ben, it was a nightmare. They were adrift in an ocean of faces, any one of which could be a potential victim, any alley a hiding place. Vipsania had been swallowed by the city, and they were left with nothing but the chilling knowledge of what she was and the growing certainty of what she intended to do. They found the businessman's black sedan abandoned in a parking garage near the city's historic center. The doors were unlocked. A high-end smartphone and a leather wallet stuffed with cash sat on the passenger seat, untouched. There was no sign of the owner, no sign of a struggle, but on the driver's side floor mat, barely visible, was a faint dusting of fine gray ash. She's learning, Iona said, staring at the car. She took what she needed, transportation, a guide, and discarded him. She's adapting faster than we can track her. She's not a frightened girl, she's an operative, Ben growled, his eyes scanning the crowded street outside the garage. She's on a mission. They established a makeshift base in a small, anonymous hotel. While Ben used his formidable skills to try and access traffic camera footage, Iona called the one person who might offer more than just guesswork. Julian, she said, when he finally answered his hospital-provided phone. His voice was weak but clear. Iona, did you find her? She's in Naples. We've lost her. Julian, I need you to think, that connection you had. Is there anything left, any sense of what she wants, where she would go? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Julian spoke again, his voice was strained, as if the effort of remembering was a physical burden. It's not a connection to her, it's a connection to the prison when I was inside. I could feel its nature. It's a parasite. It needs a host, not a person, a place. It anchors itself to a location, and from there it fishes for souls. The villa was its anchor for 2,000 years, Iona said, piecing it together. Exactly, but the villa is isolated, remote. The fishing is poor, Julian explained. Vipsania isn't just wandering, she is not the predator, she is the scout, a tendril sent out to find a better, richer feeding ground, a new place for the prison to anchor itself. What kind of place? A place of powerful, concentrated emotion. Julian's voice dropped to a whisper. A place where many people gather and feel the same thing. Sorrow, joy, fear, faith. Those places, they have a resonance. The prison can latch onto that. It can turn a place of worship into a gallery, a hospital into a waiting room. She will be drawn to the strongest emotional currents in the city. The line went quiet for a moment. Iona, Julian said, his voice urgent. Cassius is the mind, the will. He is the one who wants out, but the prison itself, it has a hunger, an old, cold, vast hunger. If it anchors in a place like Naples, the villa will seem like a quaint country cottage. You must find her before she finds a new home for it. The call ended, leaving Iona with a new, more profound sense of dread. They were not just chasing a monster. They were trying to prevent a spiritual cataclysm. For 2 days they searched. They followed a cold trail of news reports and police bulletins. A security guard at the National Archaeological Museum found in a dazed, unresponsive state. A young woman at a crowded market collapsing into a sudden, inexplicable catatonia. A priest at the Duomo di Napoli discovered sitting in a pew, staring blankly at the altar, his mind wiped clean. Each incident was a faint echo of Vipsania's passage. She was moving through the city, tasting its emotional flavors, sampling its soul. The strain was tearing their small team apart. Cormac, monitoring the villa remotely from the main camp, sent frantic updates. The figures in the fresco were growing more defined, more agitated. He reported seeing phantom shapes moving in the gray void behind them. The prison was growing stronger, feeding on the energy Vipsania was channeling back to it. Ben grew more volatile, his frustration manifesting as a dangerous impatience. He wanted action, a direct confrontation. He argued with Iona constantly. "We are chasing ghosts," he exclaimed during a heated argument in their hotel room. "While we're checking hospitals and museums, she's out there doing whatever this is. We need to go back to the source. The villa. We need to destroy that fresco. End it." "With what, Ben? Dynamite?" Iona shot back, her own nerves frayed. "We saw what happened when Cormac used a simple acoustic frequency. Do you want to see what happens when you blow it up? Do you think that will kill it, or just shatter the prison door and let everything out at once? We know nothing about its physical properties except that it is almost indestructible." Their fight was interrupted by Cormac calling again, his voice barely a whisper. "Iona." I cross-referenced the locations of the incidents. The museum, the market, the cathedral, I mapped them. They form a triangle, and I think I know what's in the center of it. Iona felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Where?" "The Basilica di San Lorenzo Maggiore," Cormac said. It's one of the oldest churches in the city. It's built directly on top of the ancient Roman Forum, the marketplace, the Macelum. It's a nexus, a place that has been a center of public life and emotion for more than 2,500 years. They arrived at the basilica as evening mass was beginning. The vast, Gothic church was filled with the sound of chanted prayers and the smell of incense. Dozens of worshippers were scattered among the pews, their faces upturned in prayer. Tourists crept along the edges, whispering and taking photographs. The air was thick with centuries of devotion, a perfect anchor. They split up, moving down opposite aisles, scanning the faces in the crowd. And then Iona saw her. Vipsania was not hiding. She was standing near the grand altar, bathed in the soft light of the votive candles. She was wearing a simple, modern black dress, obviously taken from one of her victims. Her feet were now shod in plain sandals. She looked like just another mourner, another soul seeking solace. But her stillness was absolute, and her dark, sad eyes were scanning the congregation with the cool appraisal of a farmer surveying a field ripe for harvest. Iona touched her radio. "Ben Alter, on your left." Ben's voice crackled back. "I see her moving in." As they began to converge, Vipsania's head turned. Her eyes met Iona's across the cavernous space. There was no surprise on her face, no fear, only a calm, patient recognition. She had been waiting for them. She smiled, a slow, sad, beautiful smile that did not reach her eyes, and then she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a clear, melodic tone which carried through the church, yet somehow only Iona and Ben seemed to hear it. It was perfect, unaccented Italian. "You have been so determined, doctor," she said, the words forming in Iona's mind as much as in her ears. "I chose well. Your persistence provided the final surge of energy we needed." Ben was closing the distance, moving quickly between the pews. "Iona, she's talking to you. Don't listen." "It is not a present," Vipsania continued, her gaze unwavering. "It is a lens, a way to focus one's will across the ages. The family you see, they were the first to build it. They sought immortality, and they found it. Their bodies became the foundation, their souls the key." A woman praying in a nearby pew suddenly went silent. Her head slumped forward. Then another. A man taking a photograph lowered his camera, his face going slack. All around the church, the low murmur of prayer was dying out, replaced by a spreading, unnatural silence. Iona watched in horror as one by one the worshippers and tourists stopped what they were doing. They slowly stood up, their movements synchronized, their faces becoming blank, emotionless masks. They turned, not towards the altar, but towards Iona and Ben. Vipsania was the name of the girl whose pity was the strongest, the entity in her form explained calmly. Lucius, the boy whose rage burned brightest. They are not people. They are instruments, hooks tailored for the souls of others. Ben drew up beside Iona, his hand reaching for the heavy fire extinguisher on the wall, the only weapon he could find. They were surrounded. A gallery of dozens of empty-eyed people stood between them and the exits. "Cassius grows impatient," Vipsania said, her sad smile returning. "He wishes to see this new world you have guarded so poorly. He finds this place of hollow faith, acceptable, a fine gallery for his collection. Will you not stay? The performance is about to begin. She raised a hand. Behind her, the ornate marble of the ancient altar began to darken. A faint, geometric pattern shimmered on its surface, a pattern Iona recognized with a surge of utter terror. It was the scrollwork from the edge of the fresco. The prison was anchoring itself. The show was beginning. Chapter 9: A Gallery of Souls. The first note of the performance was silence. It fell upon the basilica not as an absence of sound, but as a heavy, smothering blanket. The last echoes of the evening mass died, the shuffling of feet ceased, the whispers of tourists were cut short. It was the same profound, unnatural stillness Iona had felt in the tablinum, but magnified 100-fold, amplified by the high, vaulted ceilings, and the presence of so many living, breathing people who had suddenly stopped doing either with any real intent. Iona and Ben stood back to back in the central aisle, a small, defiant island in a sea of encroaching apathy. The congregation, now a mindless congregation of a new and terrible God, advanced on them. They did not rush. They shuffled forward with a slow, inexorable gait, their faces vacant, their eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. They were a living wall of flesh, herding the two archaeologists towards the altar, towards Vipsania. "Don't let them touch you," Ben said, his voice a low, urgent growl. He brandished the heavy fire extinguisher, its red cylinder a stark splash of color in the muted, candle-lit gloom. "They're just obstacles. We need to get to her." "She's not the target, Ben," Iona yelled back, her mind racing, desperately trying to process Vipsania's revelations. "She's just a key. The altar. The altar is the lock." On the dais, the transformation was accelerating. The intricate pattern on the marble altar now glowed with a faint, cold light. The air around it shimmered, distorting like a heat haze. Vipsania stood beside it, one hand resting on the stone, a conduit for the colossal psychic energy of the church. The combined faith, hope, and sorrow of centuries of worship was being repurposed, twisted into a new foundation for the prison. An elderly woman with a rosary clutched in her hand was the first to reach them. Her face was a placid mask, her eyes unseeing. She reached for Iona with a frail, wrinkled hand. Iona flinched back, but the woman's touch was surprisingly strong, her grip like a cold clamp. It was not physical strength. It was the weight of a will that was not her own. Ben shoved the woman aside, sending her stumbling into the pews. "They're puppets. We have to get through." He plunged into the crowd, using the heavy extinguisher as a battering ram, clearing a path. Iona followed in his wake, the blank faces and grasping hands a surreal and terrifying gauntlet. It was like fighting sleepwalkers. There was no anger in their movements, no malice, just a calm, relentless pressure. A young man in a football jersey, a mother with a toddler in her arms, a priest in his vestments, all of them instruments of an ancient alien will. They fought their way to the foot of the altar steps. The crowd did not pursue them onto the sacred space, but formed a silent, semicircular wall, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. "Now what, Iona?" Ben panted, his chest heaving. "We're cornered." Iona's eyes were locked on the altar. It was no longer just glowing. The surface was becoming translucent, the solid marble thinning into a milky, crystalline pane. Through it she could see shapes, A gray, formless void, and within it the dark, familiar figures from the fresco. Cassius, Flavia, Lucius. They were clearer now, more solid, drawing substance from the stolen energy. Vipsania turned to face them. Her sad expression was gone, replaced by an unnerving serenity. "It is done," she said, her voice echoing in the silent church. "The anchor is set. This place, this city, will be his masterpiece. So much raw material." "Who is Cassius?" Iona demanded, her voice ringing with a desperate defiance. "What is he?" Vipsania's head tilted. "He is the first, the one who grew weary of the constraints of flesh, of the slow decay of time. He learned the secret of separating the mind from the body, of carving a space for it between the moments, a home for consciousness. But a home is not a kingdom. A king needs subjects. He needs a court. He needs a collection." As she spoke, the image in the altar sharpened. Cassius was looking directly at Iona. He was no longer a flat, two-dimensional carving. He had depth, presence. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture of command, and he smiled. It was the same triumphant, predatory smile Cormac had described. Behind Iona and Ben, the crowd of puppets stirred. They turned their blank gazes from the archaeologists to the altar, and then, one by one, they began to walk forward. They walked up the steps, past Iona and Ben, and stood before the glowing marble pane. They stood there, calm and placid, just as the Plaster family had stood in the villa, an audience for the new performance. "What is she doing?" Ben whispered, horrified. "She's not doing anything," Iona realized with a sickening lurch. "Cassius is. He's calling them. This is the harvest." The first victim, the elderly woman with the rosary, stood before the altar, her face serene. The image of Lucius, the furious son, drifted forward within the crystalline prison. He reached out a hand, and the marble of the altar rippled as if it were water. His gray, ethereal hand passed through the barrier. It reached for the woman. He did not grab her. He did not touch her. His hand hovered over her chest, and a faint, shimmering cord of light was drawn from her, connecting her soul to his hand. The woman's body went limp, collapsing to the floor like a discarded coat. Her essence, a mote of fading light, was pulled through the barrier and into the gray void, where it was absorbed by the waiting form of Lucius. He seemed to grow more solid, more vibrant. "He's feeding," Iona breathed. "They're not just storing them, they're consuming their souls." The process was repeated. The young man in the football jersey was next, his life force drawn out by Flavia. Then the priest, his years of faith a rich meal for Cassius himself. It was a silent, horrifying assembly line of spiritual annihilation. The basilica had become a slaughterhouse for souls. Ben could watch no more. With a roar of pure fury he charged. He swung the fire extinguisher, not at Vipsania but at the altar itself. "I'll give you a performance," he bellowed. The heavy steel cylinder struck the glowing marble with a deafening crash. The result was not what he intended. The altar did not shatter. It rang like a colossal bell, a deep, bone-jarring tone which shook the very foundations of the church. A wave of force erupted from the point of impact, throwing Ben backward. He landed in a heap at the bottom of the steps, stunned. The images within the altar distorted violently. The figures of the family flickered. The gray void swirled like smoke in a hurricane. Iona saw a flash of something else within the chaos. Countless, terrified, translucent faces, the souls of those consumed over the centuries, screaming in a silent chorus. Vipsania staggered, her serene expression breaking. She clutched her head, a flicker of genuine pain crossing her features. You interrupt the transfer. The anchor is not stable. Iona's mind seized on the word, stable. The connection was still new, vulnerable. Ben's brute force attack had damaged it, had disrupted the flow of energy. She looked around frantically. An idea, insane and desperate, began to form. Julian's words came back to her, a place of powerful, concentrated emotion. This church was a battery of faith, but faith was not the only powerful emotion. Ben, she screamed, running to his side. He was groggy but conscious. Ben, we can't break it, but maybe we can poison it. What are you talking about? He groaned, sitting up. This whole process. It's a psychic phenomenon, she said, the theory coming together in a frantic rush. It feeds on specific emotions. Pity, faith, sorrow. Cassius is a collector. He likes his art to be refined. What if we give him something else? Something he can't digest? She looked at the remaining people in the church. Dozens of them were still standing in a stupor, waiting their turn to be consumed. They were lost, but she and Ben were not. "What's the opposite of faith, Ben?" she asked, her eyes wild. He stared at her, then at the altar where the images were slowly restabilizing. Understanding dawned on his face. "Despair," he said, his voice grim. "No," Iona said, a cold, hard certainty solidifying in her heart. She looked at Vipsania, at the triumphant, smiling image of Cassius. She thought of Sergio, of Julian, of the countless, nameless victims. Rage. She grabbed Ben's arm, pulling him to his feet. "Forget them. Forget trying to save anyone. Think about what they've done. Think about Sergio. Think about the driver. Think about every person they've hollowed out. Don't hold it back. Let it out. Focus all of it. Aim it at the altar." She closed her eyes, shutting out the horrifying scene. She let the terror and the helplessness she had felt for days curdle into a hot, focused point of anger. She dredged up every frustration, every moment of fear, and let it burn. It was a vile, corrosive feeling, anathema to her scientific, ordered mind. But it was powerful. Beside her, she felt Ben do the same. His grief for his fallen comrades, his soldier's fury at an enemy he couldn't shoot, his protective rage. It all came pouring out, a silent, psychic scream. They stood there, two small, insignificant humans, and projected a wave of pure, undiluted fury at the 2,000-year-old entity. The effect was instantaneous. The altar, which had been restabilizing, now convulsed. The light within flickered erratically. The image of Cassius recoiled, his smile vanishing, replaced by a look of shock and revulsion. The harmonious tone of the transfer was replaced by a discordant shriek which scraped at the edges of hearing. Vipsania screamed, a real human sound of agony this time. She fell to her knees, clutching the stone. "No, it is. Impure, it burns." The flow of energy had been reversed. They were not feeding the prison. They were force-feeding it poison. The translucent faces of the consumed souls in the void swirled in a frenzy. drawn to this new, violent energy. The altar began to crack, not from the physical blow but from the psychic strain. Thin, black lines spiderwebbed across the glowing marble. The shriek grew louder, more painful. "It's working," Ben yelled, his face contorted with the effort. "More," Yona screamed, focusing every ounce of her will. With a final, explosive crack, the altar shattered, not into pieces of marble, but into a shower of black, glassy dust, and a wave of psychic noise that slammed into every person in the church. The puppets, the hollowed-out congregation, collapsed in unison as if their strings had been cut. Vipsania was thrown backward, her body tumbling down the steps to lie still. The presence, the immense, ancient will of Cassius, vanished. The silence that returned was a true silence, empty, normal. Iona and Ben stood in the center of the devastated church, surrounded by dozens of unconscious bodies, their chests heaving. They had done it. They had severed the connection. Then from the back of the church a sound, a slow, rhythmic clapping. They turned. Leaning against a pillar half hidden in the shadows was a man. He was dressed in a simple, dark suit. His face was patrician, his expression one of calm, intellectual amusement. He looked ageless, his dark eyes holding a chilling depth of patience and intelligence. It was the face from the fresco. It was Cassius. "Bravo, doctor," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. He spoke perfect modern Italian. "A most unexpected denouement. You broke my lens, a pity. It was a very old, very valuable piece." He pushed himself off the pillar and took a step into the light. But no matter. The door was held open long enough for the master of the house to step through. Chapter 10. The Master of the House. The sight of Cassius, manifest in the flesh, was a paradox that threatened to shatter Iona's already fractured mind. He was not a ghost. He was not a projection. He was a solid, physical man, his expensive shoes clicking softly on the marble floor as he approached. The face was identical to the one in the fresco, the stern brow, the aquiline nose, the thin, firm line of his mouth. But the eyes were different. The carved obsidian eyes had been cold and dead. These were alive, glittering with a terrifying, ancient intelligence. Ben instinctively moved in front of Iona, shielding her. He still held the dented fire extinguisher, a pathetic toy against the creature that stood before them. "Stay back," he warned, his voice a low growl. Cassius stopped a respectful distance away, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. "Please. After such a vigorous performance, I have no desire for crude physical confrontation. I am not my son. I find rage to be inefficient." He gestured around the church at the dozens of unconscious bodies littering the floor. "All this, a tantrum. You have denied me my new gallery, it is true. You have even managed to poison the well, so to speak. This place," he tapped a thoughtful finger against his chin, "will be psychically barren for a generation. No, you have won this battle, Dr. Viana. I concede the field." What are you?" Iona stammered, stepping out from behind Ben. Cassius's smile widened. "I am a collector, a connoisseur of the soul. The human essence in its purest form is a remarkable thing, an emotion, a memory, a moment of profound faith. These are the finest art forms in the universe. I simply learned how to preserve them, permanently. You consume them, Ben spat. An uncharitable word, Cassius chided gently. Does a connoisseur consume a fine wine by drinking it? Does a lover of art consume a painting by looking at it? I absorb, I appreciate. I make these fleeting, ephemeral moments part of my own eternal existence. The vessel, he gestured to his own body, is a temporary convenience. The last one I acquired grew tiresome. Iona's mind reeled. The body he was wearing. It couldn't be his original. The businessman, she whispered, from the service station. An angry, brutish little man. But his vessel was strong, and more importantly, it came with a functioning knowledge of your bewildering modern world. A useful upgrade from the terrified goat herder I was forced to inhabit after the last time my home was disturbed, several centuries ago. He smoothed the lapel of his suit. This is much more to my liking. The casual way he spoke of inhabiting and discarding human lives was more chilling than any monstrous display. He was not a demon. He was something older, colder, and infinitely more arrogant. What about the others? Ben demanded. Vipsania, Lucius. My children, Cassius sighed, a theatrical display of paternal weariness. They were my first flawed creations, aspects of my own being given form and a rudimentary consciousness, tools designed to lure specific emotional prey, pity, rage. They served their purpose, but their forms are tied to the lens, to the anchor. When you shattered it, you shattered them. He glanced at the still form of Vipsania lying at the foot of the altar. A shame. She was quite effective. He then fixed his gaze on Iona, his dark eyes seeming to strip away every layer of her scientific skepticism, every defense. You, doctor, you are far more interesting. That mind, so ordered, so disciplined, and yet capable of such a potent primal outburst, a rare combination, a true masterpiece. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. The noise from the street was beginning to filter back into the church. The spell of silence was broken. Soon, this place would be flooded with police, with medics. It seems our time is at an end, Cassius said, his tone one of polite regret. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, modern smartphone, the businessman's phone. With a few deft taps of his thumb, he brought up a screen. I have learned so much in the past few days. Your world is a tapestry of information, a global network of whispers. It makes finding new galleries, new collections so wonderfully efficient. He turned the screen towards them. It showed a live news feed from a city on the other side of the world. A massive protest. Thousands of people packed into a city square, their faces a mixture of fury and ecstatic hope. A colossal, raw, untapped source of emotional energy. There are so many places where the art is simply crying out to be collected, Cassius said softly. You have cost me Naples, but the world is a very, very large place. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and gave them a small, formal bow. I thank you for the challenge, Doctor. It has been an invigorating interlude, but I am a patient being. I will rebuild my lens. I will find a new home. And perhaps one day I will come back for a piece as rare and valuable as you. With that, he turned and walked away, not towards the main entrance, but towards a small, shadowed side door. He moved with a calm, unhurried confidence, melting into the darkness of the ancient church, just as the first paramedics burst through the main doors, their faces a mask of shock at the scene of devastation before them. Iona and Ben did not try to stop him. They were frozen not by fear but by the sheer, crushing scale of their failure. They had not won. They had not saved anyone. They had merely inconvenienced a god. They had closed a single, dusty museum in a world filled with sprawling, vibrant art galleries, and now the curator was free, walking among the exhibits, deciding which one to acquire next. As the paramedics began checking on the unconscious forms, Iona looked at Ben. His face was pale, his expression grim. They were the only two people on Earth who knew the truth. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, smiled, and politely excused itself to find a better view. The battle for the Basilica di San Lorenzo Maggiore was over, but the war for the soul of the world had just begun. Chapter 11: The Dust of the Road. In the chaotic aftermath, amidst the flashing lights of police cars and the urgent clamor of medics, Iona and Ben became ghosts. They were two figures in dirty, travel-worn clothes, their faces etched with a trauma no one else could comprehend. They gave a brief, disjointed statement to a bewildered police captain. A gas leak, a sudden pressure change, mass hysteria. A story so flimsy it was believed only because the truth was so utterly impossible. They were dismissed as shell-shocked tourists and told not to leave the city. They ignored the order. Before the sun rose again, they were in their battered field vehicle, heading north, leaving the wounded city of Naples behind them. They didn't speak for the first 100 kilometers. There were no words to encompass the magnitude of what had happened. They had faced an entity from the dawn of the Roman Empire and had survived, but survival felt like a profound and hollow defeat. Iona stared out the window at the passing countryside, but she didn't see it. She saw Cassius's patient, amused smile. She saw the live news feed on his phone. A protest in Hong Kong, a riot in Cairo, a political rally in America. The possibilities were endless. He was a psychic virus, and the modern, interconnected world was his perfect transmission vector. What now? Ben's voice was raspy, cutting through the hum of the engine. Iona turned to look at him. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The soldier in him was lost, stripped of a definable enemy, a clear objective. "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty of it was terrifying. "We have no proof, no evidence. We are two people with an impossible story. Who would listen? Who would believe us?" "Julian Wood," Ben said quietly. The name hung in the air between them. They had left him behind. A call to the hospital had confirmed he was stable, but suffering from what the doctors called a profound dissociative episode. He was safe for now, but for how long? Iona pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and found Cormac's number. He answered on the first ring. "Iona, are you okay? The news. They're saying there was some kind of accident at a church." "Cormac, I need you to do something for me," Iona said, her voice low and intense. "And you cannot ask any questions. You must do it immediately." "Okay," he said, his voice hesitant. "Go to the villa. Take the heaviest equipment you can find, jackhammers, cutters, anything. I want you to destroy the fresco. I want you to grind it into absolute dust. Then I want you to take the plaster casts, all of them, including Sergio, and I want you to obliterate them. Then you will call in the civil engineers and you will tell them the site is unstable. You will have them collapse the entire structure and bury it under tons of rock and concrete. Erase it. Make it so no one can ever find it again. There was a stunned silence on the other end. Iona, that's the greatest archaeological find of the century. You want me to destroy it. It is not a find, Cormac, it is a weapon, and it is broken. We can't let anyone else stumble upon it. We can't let him have a way back to it. Do you understand? She could hear the struggle in his voice, the conflict between his scientific reverence and the trust he had in her. Yes, I understand, he finally said, his voice thin. I'll do it. And Cormac, she added, a cold resolve hardening her voice. When you are done, burn your notes, wipe your hard drives. Forget everything we found in that house. This discovery never happened. She hung up, the finality of her own words chilling her to the bone. She was actively erasing history, committing an act which went against every principle she had ever held. But it was no longer about preservation. It was about containment. They drove north towards Rome, not to the safety of an embassy, but to the one place that might hold a sliver of an answer, the Vatican's secret archives. It was a desperate, insane long shot, but Cassius was Roman. He was ancient. He had spoken of the eruption as an act of a god saving the world from him. That implied knowledge. It implied that someone, somewhere in the 2,000 years since, might have known about him. Records of cults, of strange happenings around Vesuvius, of other lenses or galleries. If a record existed anywhere, it would be in the one library that had survived the fall of Rome and the ravages of time. You think a priest is going to help us hunt a 2,000-year-old soul vampire? Ben asked, a hint of his old skepticism returning. No, Iona said, watching the highway signs for Rome flash past. But a librarian might. He mentioned a goat herder he inhabited after his home was disturbed. That means he's been out before. There might be a pattern, a record, a weapon, anything. Their new mission was absurd, a fool's errand. They were no longer scientists or soldiers. They were hunters, armed with nothing but a terrible secret and the knowledge that they were impossibly, cosmically outmatched. They were chasing a ghost who could be anywhere, anyone, a collector of souls who now had the entire, vibrant, chaotic modern world as his personal gallery. As they drove, Iona reached into her satchel and pulled out the one artifact she had kept from the villa. It was the audio recorder. She had not wiped the file. She plugged in her headphones, shielding the sound from Ben. She needed to hear it again, to remind herself of the hook, of the weaponized sorrow that had started it all. She pressed play. She expected to hear the sibilant whispers, the sound of Vipsania's weeping. But the recording had changed. The weeping was gone. The whispers were gone. Instead, there was a new sound captured in the final moments before Julian had collapsed. It was a voice, a man's voice. It was deep, calm, and cultured, a voice she now recognized with a surge of ice-cold dread. It was Cassius, and he was not speaking Latin or any ancient tongue. He was speaking clear, perfect English with an accent she couldn't quite place. He was not pleading or threatening. He was reciting something, like a poet committing a verse to memory. Item 1, the voice on the recorder said, cool and precise. A scholar's obsession. Item 2, a soldier's grief. Item 3, there was a pause, a scientist's pride. Iona ripped the headphones from her ears, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had been there, listening, analyzing them from the very beginning. They were not the discoverers. They were not the heroes who fought back. They were the first items in his new collection. Chapter 12. The Echo in the Archive. The Vatican was a fortress of faith and secrets, its ancient walls a stark contrast to the buzzing modernity of Rome. Getting access to the apostolic archive was not a matter of simply asking. It required credentials, influence, and a stated purpose of impeccable scholarly merit. Iona had none of these left. Her reputation was in ashes, tied to a dig site she had just ordered destroyed. They spent 2 days in a cheap pensione on the outskirts of the city, living on stale bread and bitter coffee. Ben, using a burner phone and a series of encrypted connections from his past, tried to find a way in. He called on old favors, cashed in markers from forgotten conflicts, trying to find a name, a contact, anyone who owed him enough to bend the ironclad rules of the Holy See. Iona, meanwhile, fell into a feverish state of research. The recording of Cassius's voice was her Rosetta Stone, a scholar's obsession, a soldier's grief, a scientist's pride. He wasn't just listing their weaknesses, he was categorizing them, labeling them like specimens. This was his methodology. He was a collector, and every great collector has a catalog. He's not just moving randomly, she explained to Ben late one night, her laptop screen illuminating her pale, exhausted face. He is methodical. The protest he showed us on his phone. It wasn't just a source of energy. It was a specific type, righteous anger, political fervor. He's curating his collection. She brought up satellite images of the protest. It was in Seoul. He's not just looking for crowds. He's looking for the emotional signature of a place, the dominant feeling. Naples was a city of faith and history. He tried to anchor there. Now he's tasting others. Ben finally got a lead. An old contact from an intelligence agency, a man who now worked in a secular role within the Vatican administration. He owed Ben his life. A meeting was arranged, cloaked in secrecy, in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica. Their contact was a man named Fausto, thin, nervous, with eyes that had seen too much. He listened to their story, his expression shifting from disbelief to a dawning, horrified recognition. He did not call them crazy. There are stories, Fausto said, his voice a low whisper as they walked through a deserted colonnade. Accounts that are quarantined, not for reasons of faith but because they are infectious. Ideas that are dangerous to know. He spoke of a subsection of the archives, the Archivum Damnationis, where texts deemed spiritually perilous were held. Accounts of entities that were not demonic in the theological sense but something other, parasites of the soul. I cannot give you access, Fausto said, shaking his head. It is impossible, but he slipped a small, heavy key into Ben's hand. There is a service entrance to the sub-levels. A cartographer from the 17th century, one Father Alighieri, spent his life mapping these emotional signatures you speak of. He believed certain places on Earth were psychically weak, prone to infection. His work was deemed heretical and locked away. If anyone knew of your Cassius, it would have been him. He gave them a location, a time, and a warning. You will have 1 hour. After that the alarms will sound. God be with you. That night they moved through the sleeping city. The service entrance was a simple, unmarked door in a high stone wall. The key worked. They descended into a labyrinth of cool, silent corridors, the air thick with the smell of old paper and beeswax. It was a city of forgotten knowledge, miles of shelves holding the collective memory of Western civilization. They found the section Fausto had described. A heavy iron gate separated it from the main archive. It was a prison for books. Ben, using a set of tension wrenches and a lifetime of grim experience, picked the ancient lock. The room was small, circular, and lined with leather-bound codices chained to the shelves. They found the works of Father Alighieri. His maps were masterpieces of paranoid genius, depicting the world not in terms of nations, but of emotional resonance. And his journals, they were filled with a spidery, frantic script. Iona's Latin was rusty, but the words leaped off the page. Alighieri wrote of a collector animarum, a soul collector, an ancient Roman patrician who, through a dark pagan ritual, had created a lens, a way to project his consciousness and trap the souls of others. He wrote that the entity was dislodged during the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, but that its anchor, its domus, remained. And then she found it. The priest had discovered another lens, not in Italy but in Alexandria, in the ruins of the great library. It had been shattered, but he described its material, a strange, unearthly stone which absorbed light and was cold to the touch. And he described the entity's weakness. Ben, look, Iona whispered, her finger tracing the faded script. The lens is a psychic amplifier, but it's also a bottleneck. It focuses his will, but it also contains him. When the lens is shattered, his projections, the lures like Vipsania, they dissolve. And he himself is forced back to his source, to his anchor, to the villa. But the villa's gone, Ben said. Cormac buried it. The structure is gone, Iona corrected, her mind racing. But the prison isn't the house. The house was just built on top of the anchor. The anchor is geological, a weak point, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. She looked up at Ben, her eyes wide with a terrifying, dawning realization. We can't chase him around the world. We can't fight him on his terms. We have to make him come back to us. The journal described a ritual, not of exorcism but of calling, a way to create a powerful emotional beacon, a psychic siren that the collector in his arrogance would be unable to ignore. It required an object of great personal significance, an emotional lightning rod to be placed at the site of the anchor, and it required a sacrifice, not of a life, of a memory, the willing, permanent sacrifice of the caller's most cherished memory to be burned as fuel for the beacon. A bell chimed in the distance. Their hour was up. They fled the archives, the journal of the mad priest clutched in Iona's hands. As they emerged into the pre-dawn light of Rome, Iona knew what she had to do. They were no longer hunters. They were the bait. Chapter 13. An Offering at the Anchor. Returning to the Pompeii dig site was a grim homecoming. The place was deserted. Cormac had been brutally efficient. The villa was gone. The excavation pit was a raw, open wound in the earth, filled with shattered rock and fresh concrete, a tombstone of modern engineering placed over an ancient grave. But Iona could still feel it, a faint, cold pressure in the air. The anchor was still there, buried but active. They waited for nightfall. Ben stood guard, a silent, grim shadow, while Iona prepared. The ritual described in Alighiri's journal was terrifyingly simple. It was a transaction, an offering for an audience. "I have to do this alone," she told Ben, her voice steady. "The beacon needs a single, focused point of origin, your grief. It would interfere, complicate the signal." "Iona, this is insane," he argued, his voice low and fierce. "You're talking about psychic surgery on yourself. What if it doesn't work? What if it just leaves you an empty shell like those people in the church?" "It's the only way," she said, her resolve absolute. She reached into her bag and pulled out the object the ritual required. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. "My father gave this to me the day I decided to become an archaeologist. He said it was to remind me that every piece of the past was once part of someone's living, breathing present." She clutched the locket in her hand. The memory was so clear, so warm. Her father's proud smile, the weight of the silver in her palm, the sense of a future filled with discovery and purpose. It was her foundational memory, the memory that had made her who she was. It was the price of admission. She walked to the edge of the filled-in pit and knelt, placing the locket on the rough surface of the concrete. She closed her eyes and followed the instructions from the journal. She didn't chant or speak. She simply focused her mind, dredging up the memory of her father. She didn't just remember it, she relived it, pouring every detail, every sensation, every ounce of love and pride and hope associated with it into the silver locket. Then she let it go. The feeling was indescribable. It was a violent, wrenching amputation of the soul. A piece of her identity, a cornerstone of her being, was torn away. She felt it burn, consumed by a process she couldn't see, a psychic fire ignited in the space between worlds. A wave of cold, dizzying emptiness washed over her, and she nearly collapsed. The memory was gone, not forgotten but erased. She knew she had a father. She knew he had given her the locket, but the emotional core of the event, the warmth, the meaning, it was a blank, sterile void. A low hum filled the air. The ground beneath her vibrated faintly. From the center of the concrete slab, a faint, cold light began to glow, pushing up from the buried depths. The beacon was lit. She had paid the toll. She stood up, her legs unsteady, a profound coldness inside her that had nothing to do with the night air. "It's done," she whispered. They didn't have to wait long. The air grew thick, heavy with the pressure of a vast, approaching consciousness. The stars seemed to dim. A wind rose from nowhere, swirling dust and grit across the desolate site. And then he was there. He did not walk from the darkness. He simply coalesced. One moment the space in front of them was empty. The next, Cassius was standing there, his dark suit immaculate, his expression not of anger but of intense, academic curiosity. "Remarkable," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. He looked from the glowing beacon to Iona. "To weaponize a memory, to burn a part of your own soul just to get my attention. You are, without a doubt, the most fascinating specimen I have ever encountered, Dr. Viana. This ends tonight, Ben growled, stepping forward. In his hands he held the only weapon they had been able to devise. It was a powerful, industrial electromagnet, salvaged from a scrapyard and wired to a stack of truck batteries. A crude, desperate gambit based on a single line from Alighieri's journal which described the entity's essence as having a sympathy for the lodestone. Cassius glanced at the device and chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You think to trap me with magnetism. My dear soldier, I am not a creature of iron and electricity. I am a creature of will. We're not trying to trap you, Iona said, her voice hollowed out by her sacrifice but steady. We're just holding you here. Cassius's smile faltered. He looked from Iona to Ben, and then back to the glowing anchor point. A flicker of understanding, and for the first time, alarm appeared in his ancient eyes. You did not call me here to fight. A collection needs a gallery, Iona said, her voice resonating with a cold, hard finality. A king needs a kingdom, and a prisoner needs a prison. Ben let out a roar and lunged forward, not at Cassius, but past him. He slammed the heavy electromagnet down onto the concrete slab, directly over the glowing beacon. He hit the switch. The magnet screamed to life with a deafening hum. The light from the anchor flared violently, drawn up into the device. The ground shook. Cassius cried out, a sound of genuine pain and fury. He was not being pulled by the magnet but the beacon. The psychic call fueled by Iona's memory was now anchored to this world by a powerful, artificial magnetic field. The call had become a cage. Cassius was bound to the anchor. He was tethered, his consciousness unable to flee, unable to project. He was trapped in the vessel of the businessman, standing on the site of his original damnation. "What have you done?" he snarled, his patrician calm shattering, revealing the raging 2,000-year-old prisoner beneath. "We gave you what you wanted," Ben said, straining to hold the bucking electromagnet in place. "You're home." Iona walked towards him, her face a mask of cold resolve. She held the last piece of their plan in her hand. It was a simple, bronze Roman stylus, the one from the villa, the one that had appeared as an offering to Vipsania. She had taken it from the evidence locker before they left. "You collect moments, Cassius," she said, her voice devoid of fear. "Here is one for your collection, the moment it ends." She lunged forward and drove the pointed end of the stylus deep into his chest. The vessel of the businessman barely flinched. Cassius laughed, a gurgling sound. "Flesh is meaningless to me, Doctor. I will simply discard this vessel and find another." "I know," Iona said, looking him directly in the eye. And with her other hand she pressed the small, silver locket, the conduit for her sacrificed memory, against the hilt of the stylus. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The locket, still resonating with the psychic energy of the beacon, touched the stylus, which was embedded in the host vessel of the entity, who was in turn bound to the anchor. A circuit was completed. Cassius screamed, a sound that was not human. It was the shriek of a mind being torn apart. The beacon of Iona's sacrificed memory, her purest moment of hope and purpose, poured into him. It was not a poison like her rage. It was an antidote. 2,000 years of cold, predatory consciousness were flooded with a single, perfect, selfless human emotion. It was anathema to his very being. His body convulsed. Light erupted from his eyes, his mouth. The form of the businessman flickered, revealing the swirling gray void within. Countless screaming, translucent faces, the souls he had consumed, poured out of him, freed from their prison, dissolving into the night sky like sparks from a fire. The vessel collapsed, turning to fine gray ash before it even hit the ground. The electromagnet sputtered and died, its batteries drained. The light from the anchor faded. The wind stopped. A silence. Chapter 14. The Silence of the Living. They stood in the silence of the aftermath, two solitary figures under the vast, uncaring stars. The ash of Cassius's last vessel blew away on the night breeze, leaving nothing behind. The ground was still. The oppressive, ancient coldness was gone. It was just a construction site again, a place of mundane rock and concrete. Ben released his grip on the dead electromagnet and collapsed to his knees, his body racked with shuddering breaths of exhaustion and relief. It was over. Iona remained standing, her hand still outstretched, clutching the silver locket. She felt empty. The elation of victory, the relief of survival, none of it came. The space inside her where her most cherished memory used to be was a cold, aching void. She had won, but the price had been a piece of herself. She had looked into the collector's eyes, and in the end, she had been forced to become a collector herself, collecting all her hope and purpose into a single point and turning it into a weapon. A week later, they sat in a small cafe in Rome. The world was oblivious. The news reported a minor seismic event near Pompeii. The dozens of catatonic victims in Naples were a medical mystery that would be debated for years. The story was over, but there would be no victory parade. Their reward was the silence, the knowledge that the monster was gone, and the shared, secret burden of that knowledge. Julian was recovering. His mind, freed from the prison's influence, was slowly healing. Iona had spoken to him. He remembered nothing of the gray void, only a vague sense of a terrible dream. It was a mercy. Cormac had buried the villa as instructed. He never asked why. Some things he had learned were better left unearthed. "What will you do now?" Ben asked, stirring his coffee. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper. The soldier had fought his war and was now adrift in the peace. Iona looked down at the silver locket in her hand. It was just a piece of metal to her now, a souvenir from a forgotten country. "I don't know," she said, and for the first time the words didn't feel terrifying. They felt open. "He took my past. Maybe that means I'm finally free to build a new future." She had spent her life giving a voice to the dead, trying to understand the stories of the past. But she had learned a terrible lesson. Some stories are not meant to be told. Some doors are not meant to be opened. And some silences are there for a reason, a warning to the living to leave the dead to their own quiet collection of moments, and to be profoundly, terrifyingly grateful for their own. The world was full of wonders and horrors, and she and Ben were now its secret, weary guardians, forever watching for the next impossible story, praying they would never find one. The end.